April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet above occupied Normandy, a silhouette crossed the blue like an island of iron. The engines droned with a sound more like a freight train than a fighter. The smell of castor and oil hung in the thin air, carried through open cockpits in a memory that would not fade. On the German side, a young pilot squinted through the sun and laughed. From his rear seat, the sight was absurd. A bulky single-engine airplane with a wide fuselage and a massive propeller. A machine that looked like it should be hauling cargo rather than fighting other aircraft. They called it a flying milk bottle and shrugged. In the cockpit of the heavy aircraft, behind a visor fogged with breath and condensation, a pilot named Robert S. Johnson listened to that laugh and tightened his grip on the stick. He had flown the Thunderbolt on few sorties and knew that ridiculed did not calculate range rate or rate of fire. He knew what a turbo could do at altitude, what concentrated Browning fire could do when directed at the right moment. This is the story of how laughter turned to fear in the skies, how a plane designed for survival in raw power became a leviathan of the air, a machine whose industrial logic and armament rewrote tactics and turned scorn into dread. They laughed in April of 1943. By May of 1945, few were laughing anymore. In Trenton, New Jersey in late 1939, a young engineer named Alexander Kartveli sketched profiles and cross-sections under fluorescent lamplight while the noise of the Republic aviation shop spilled through the walls. He had fled earlier upheavals and brought with him a philosophy of robustness and simplicity. Kartveli did not prize graceful lines. He prized engines that could gulp air and return home. His notes read like a manifesto: survival, heavy radial engine, deep rugged fuselage, and generous fuel capacity for long escort sorties. The brief that landed on his desk in 1940 demanded a machine that could carry heavy armament, sustain hits, and still get pilots home. It was less an exercise in beauty than a calculation of margins of safety. The early project meetings in Farmingdale were charged and raw. Engineers argued about weight, about drag, about the practicality of overbuilt structures. Some voices favored agility, others favored firepower. Kartveli said, "We will build a bulldog, not a greyhound," and meant it. The initial specification called for 8 Browning machine guns, heavy armor plating around the pilot, and a turbocharged radial engine to keep power at altitude. The result looked ungainly, yet inside its girth was the potential to change engagements, not by finesse, but by volume of fire and survivability. Its name at the factory was Thunderbolt, a name chosen to evoke force rather than elegance. Early skeptics compared it to a locomotive in the sky, but the designers argued that in attrition, the one that stayed in the fight could extract victory. Testing began in the spring of 1941 at Middleton with men who smelled of grease and coffee and the soft bark of engines cooling on the tarmac. Flight tests were rough. On one takeoff, the belly canted and a tire shredded, spraying rubber and dust. In another trial, a control cable frayed and the pilot had to wrestle the aircraft back to the field with a combination of throttle and trim. The instrumentation panel rattled with every RPM shift, and the turbocharged engine produced surges that required careful throttle discipline. Mechanics like Sergeant Miguel Ortiz learned to read these vibrations like a language. Ortiz reclined beneath cowling one October night, wiping his hands on a greasy rag. He would later say, "It bit me once, and then I learned to listen to it." The program logged accidents, 22 entries in the first year that ranged from cracked prop spinners to forced landings. Commanders issued memoranda that read almost clinical in their patience, noting loss rates and pilot survivability. Pilots who survived came away with stories of heaviness that hid a stubborn heart and of controls that resisted but did not fail. Kartveli watched test reports, and one line kept recurring: the plane came back. That redundancy would prove decisive. Early accidents taught design teams to reinforce spar attachments, to add more armor behind the cockpit, and to adjust the propeller pitch curve to smooth torque spikes. Lessons were expensive, lives and expensive parts, but they hardened the airframe and smoothed its temperament. The first operational units to receive the Thunderbolt were skeptical. The 56th Fighter Group received its initial batch in late 1942, and its pilots compared it unfavorably to sleeker machines. At a briefing in the pale light of dawn, Major Donald Blell stood in front of the formation map and said, "They are big targets. You will tell me they are slow." And the response from a chorus of pilots was laughter. A dialogue followed in that brief that would mark the tone of early campaigns. How many guns does it have? 8. How many Corton bombs can it carry? Fuel tanks can be added for range, but it was meant to fight, not hunt ships. So we are escorting something that looks like a brick? We are escorting firepower and survivability. These exchanges were blunt and spiced with skepticism. The sensory reality of the scene was immediate. The smell of wet tar on the runway, the metallic taste of breakfast coffee, the thrumming of idling engines, the dry paper of maps, and the varnished wood of briefing tables. Pilots felt rough canvas jackets, inside which the chill of morning found them. The first sorties produced mixed results. Against lightly defended transports, the Thunderbolt proved surprising. It could dive, hold speed, and bring sustained Browning fire to bear. Against fast BF-109s or FW-190s, it struggled in dogfight style, but when tactics shifted to energy fighting, to boom and zoom, it shone. Initial losses to fighters and flak came with hard lessons. Debrief rooms smelled of sweat and antiseptic. Wounded men described a machine that took punishment and still returned the favor. Opinions hardened on both sides. Some Allied commanders wanted to use the Thunderbolt as an escort and ground attack one, like a Swiss Army knife. Others insisted on preserving it for high-altitude bomber defense. The arguments shaped doctrine. The first engagements with Luftwaffe fighters contained scenes of derision that turned quickly to alarm. In one engagement over the French coast, a flight of Thunderbolts escorted B-17s and were spotted by a German formation flying above. The German unit radioed back laughing, "Look at those cows," and prepared to swoop. The exchange before contact was terse. Formation 1, report. 3 bandits above 9 o'clock high. Bogies closing, dive on the bombers. Break to engage, protect the bombers. Turn left now, left now. The Thunderbolts climbed their heavy wings groaning and then descended with a momentum that changed the geometry of the fight. The soundscape shifted from laughter to metallic roar, and the smell of cordite spiked in the recordings. One German pilot later reported the shock of concentrated Browning fire and the impression of being hit by a wall of lead. The statistics from that day were telling. 5 enemy fighters claimed and 2 Thunderbolts damaged but able to limp home. The Luftwaffe intelligence notes began to mutate from mockery to wary respect. The tandem of turbo supercharger and large propeller allowed the Thunderbolt to maintain speed and energy at high altitude, where some German engines began to lose power. That preserved energy let pilots impose their terms on the engagement and not simply react to enemy maneuvers. Wounded airmen came back with tales of holes and fuselages that looked like a sieve, and yet the plane landed. Ground crews counted spent shell belts like harvest and marveled at how many rounds had been fired from 8 Browning barrels. A new refrain circulated among enemy and ally alike. The Thunderbolt was ugly, but it could shoot. One combat incident would crystallize perceptions and become the turning point. Pilots told and retold the story. On May 12, 1943, a specially tasked escort mission over Marseille turned into a trial by fire. A flight led by Captain Harold Briggs climbed into a mistaken gap in radar coverage and ran into a coordinated intercept.
The radio exchanges recorded in the mission log show urgency, panic, and a test of improvisation. Bandits, energy high. We're pinned on the tail of the lead bomber. Fire out front 3 o'clock. Split and hammerhead left, stay on speed. Keep your energy and dive, then climb. The sensory detail is brutal. The smell of burning oil, the taste of copper in the back of the throat, the hit that sounded like wood snapping when a shell found the wing spar. One Thunderbolt piloted by Lieutenant James Carter took a direct cannon burst inside the fuselage.
Bay and the observers watched a section of skin flutter away in the wind. Carter's voice comes across over the crackling radio. "I have control issues. I am losing trim. I am bailing if she does not respond." Grounded eyes saw his parachute blossom over olive groves, and later Carter would describe the sound like 1,000 pebbles hitting the plexiglass. All 7 other Thunderbolts reacted with disciplined formation maneuvers and covering fire. They did not attempt classic dogfighting. Instead, they used dive speed and long-range fire to shape the engagement. The result was that what began as a potential rout became a tactical victory. The bomber formation survived, and several interceptors were downed. After that mission, German units stopped comparing the Thunderbolt to a milk bottle and began reporting it as a serious escort with exceptional survivability. News traveled back to frontline squadrons and to the factories where men like General Walter Thompson measured parts output and adjusted priority for armor and gun mounts. A technical analysis helps explain why these incidents repeated and why tactics adapted. The Thunderbolt used a large radial engine coupled to a turbocharger unit that fed compressed air to the engine at high altitudes, keeping manifold pressure high and power available when competitors found their engines starving. The turbo used exhaust gas to spin a turbine, which then drove a compressor that increased intake air density. That process allowed sustained power up to and above 25,000 feet rather than the rapid decay typical of naturally aspirated engines. The aircraft's armament consisted of 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 4 per wing, mounted in pairs to concentrate fire at convergence points. Convergence was set on each wing to focus the streams of bullets at specific ranges, typically 200 to 300 yards, optimizing destructive density. The Thunderbolt also featured substantial armor plating around the cockpit and self-sealing fuel cells, which reduced the probability of fatal crew loss after an impact. These technical trade-offs came at the cost of weight and drag, which reduced roll rate and instantaneous turn rate, but increased energy retention in dives. Tactically, pilots learned to exploit speed and altitude to conduct boom and zoom attacks, climbing back to altitude between firing runs. The math of this approach relied on potential energy converted to kinetic energy, and the high muzzle weight and rate of fire of the Browning set ensured that a short, concentrated burst could cripple engines or sever control surfaces. In concrete numbers, the aircraft could carry thousands of rounds per sortie, often consuming over 10,000 cartridges in a long ground attack mission, which meant logistics and ammunition supply had to scale to match the tactics. As the P-47 matured, variants proliferated to match different roles. Engineers introduced paddle braid propellers to smooth torque handling and revised supercharger gear ratios to fine-tune high-altitude performance. The Razorback canopy gave way to bubble canopies in later fighter versions, which improved rear visibility and
pilot situational awareness. For ground attack, the aircraft received reinforced wings with hardpoints to carry drop tanks or bombs, which extended range or provided additional ordnance. The addition of drop tanks changed mission profiles, allowing long escort sorties across the channel and deep into enemy territory. Ground attack Thunderbolts often carried a pair of 500-pound bombs and rockets, a configuration that transformed them into flying artillery. Pilots like Robert Johnson reported the feedback change when delivering strafing runs. The ground shook with the detonation of rockets, the air smelled of ozone and burning vegetation, and the metal taste of spent brass filled cockpits. Each variant trade-off was clear. More payload meant heavier takeoff and different handling, but the underlying philosophy of resiliency remained. Technical briefs explained that changes to propeller pitch could alter climb rate by measurable percentages. and adding armor behind the pilot increased probability of returning from flak hits by a significant factor. These incremental improvements and variant proliferation allowed the Thunderbolt to grow from a heavy escort to a multifunctional workhorse. Industrial logistics underpinned that operational success. Production lines at Republic Aviation expanded output from small batches to production in series. Thousands of airframes passed through assembly jigs. A typical plant shift involved thousands of worker hours and dozens of suppliers. The factory atmosphere was metallic and hot, the smell of lacquer and cutting oil. General Walter Thompson coordinated supply and recorded output goals that read like a ledger of capability. 2,000 airframes in the first year, parts per week 800. Prop assemblies, ammunition belts per sortie consumption, tens of thousands of rounds. Training pipelines altered to deliver pilots qualified not just in dogfight technique, but in energy management. Flight hours required for conversion training rose from 20 to 60 hours in simulated attack profiles, including dive practice, rocket and bomb delivery, and emergency procedures for turbocharged engines. Fuel consumption rates during long sorties were massive, requiring tanker and depot planning. A single Thunderbolt sortie could burn hundreds of gallons of high-octane fuel, and that placed pressure on logistics chains from Oklahoma refineries to forward airfields in England. Ground crews were organized into teams with precise roles. Armament loaders like Sergeant Miguel Ortiz remained essential, as did the supply clerks who tracked belt counts and shell casings returned for inspection. The industrial story was not just numbers. It was a human chain that kept the machines in the sky and enabled sustained pressure on enemy resources. Throughout this story, a set of characters moved the narrative forward and exemplified the human element of technological change. The protagonist, Robert S. Johnson, the ace pilot who rose through the 56th Fighter Group, learned to trust the Thunderbolt and to exploit its strengths. His backstory began in a small Iowa town where, as a boy, he disassembled tractors to understand powertrains. He enlisted early and earned his wings after crash-landing a trainer, in which he learned the value of composure.
Arrived in England with a sense of humility and a habit of methodical checklists. On his first mission, he watched a friend go down and vowed to come back as often as he could to keep other crews safe. His early service record shows a pattern of aggressive energy management and careful planning. He preferred dive attacks followed by quick climbs into clouds. Johnson was not born an ace. He became one through repetition and a stubborn attention to systems of the aircraft and the aircraft ground crews. Friends described him as laconic with a dry smile, a pilot who read engine instruments like someone reads a book. He preferred to brief with diagrams and always annotated his maps with fuel burn estimates. That procedural discipline, combined with willingness to push the Thunderbolt's envelope, turned him into a leader who influenced tactics across his group. On the other side, a composite antagonist emerges in the person of Oberleutnant Hans Richter, a Luftwaffe pilot who represented the best of German fighter tactics and skepticism about what he called industrial heavyweights. Richter grew up near Cologne and joined the air service in his early 20s. He prided himself on precision in the short turn and a philosophy that saw air combat as a ballet of position and timing. When he first encountered Thunderbolts, he reported disdain in his log. Clumsy and slow, no finesse. Yet over time, his entries shifted to notes of frustration and tactical adaptation. Richter's backstory explains the Luftwaffe institutional influence on his thinking, grounded in years of training that emphasized turning fights and exploiting light aircraft advantages. That doctrine initially gave Germans an edge, but as attrition deepened, Richter had to reconcile a changing battlefield where material volume and survivability began to outweigh acute maneuverability. His letters home later bear the texture of a man whose assumptions were challenged, the cadence of post-war reflections showing regret and a slow respect for the enemy machines that had forced doctrinal change. Secondary characters populated the narrative with specific names and actions. Major Donald Bliley issued early escort doctrines and coordinated missions for the 56th Fighter Group.
Lieutenant James Carter flew a near-fatal mission that became legendary for his calm abandonment and graceful survival. Sergeant Miguel Ortiz led a ground crew who learned to patch panels and count rounds under blackout conditions, and later trained replacements. Captain Harold Briggs led the Marseille mission, confronted the intercept, and arranged formation discipline that saved bombers. General Walter Thompson coordinated factory output and adjusted supply chains to meet sortie rates. Engineer Alexander Kartveli designed and argued for the Thunderbolt's structural philosophy and personally visited flight lines to see the machine in action. Captain Elaine Morris, a rare woman in aircraft maintenance at a depot, inspected self-sealing fuel tanks and developed faster repair jigs. Intelligence officer Captain Harold Fenwick compiled enemy reports and translated Luftwaffe communiques that shifted Allied tactics. Each name appears doing something specific. Each contributes to the scaffolding of
success from blueprint to combat. Tension punctuated the campaign in repeated moments, each a test of machine and man. One early tension arose when a Thunderbolt lost its turbocharger mid-mission over Brittany and descended into heavy cloudbank, an engine coughing and the pilot radioing that he could not maintain altitude. The radio chatter was ragged. "Mayday, mayday, engine is stalling, losing manifold pressure. Can you feather prop? Negative, not responding." Pilots around attempted to guide him to a field, and one wingman circled low, acting as a beacon. The scene presented sensory detail, the whine of the failing turbo, the gasoline smell thick in the cockpit, the cold bite at altitude, and the rain on the canopy like pins. The pilot forced a landing in a hedgerow and survived. Another tension occurred when logistical bottlenecks reduced ammunition availability for a week of operations. Ground crews rationed belts, and pilots briefed on conservative fire discipline. Men argued, voices rose in cramped workshops, the metallic clink of empty cases a constant reminder. A third came during an intense flak barrage over a bridge siege, where Thunderbolts took direct hits and returned with punctured radiators and smoking oil. The cockpit filled with a choking, acrid smell, while the pilot wrestled trim to keep wings from folding. These episodes each lasted long enough to feel like an eternity and short enough to be condensed into decisive minutes, and they tested doctrine and ingenuity. A procedural description clarifies how pilots adjusted gun convergence and why it mattered. Engineers set gun convergence by aligning the 4 guns in each wing to cross at a predetermined range, typically 200 to 300 yards. During pre-mission checks, crews fired live rounds into a calibrated target frame at the factory range, measuring groups and adjusting the right and left sets to ensure the stream intersected at the planned distance. This optimization increased hit probability by concentrating pellet density on target and reduced time on target during passes, a crucial factor when conducting high-speed boom and zoom attacks. The calibration process required precise rigging of gun mounts and repeated test fire sessions to ensure thermal expansion in barrels did not shift point of impact. A second technical process description explains turbocharger maintenance and the emergency checklist. Turbochargers relied on precise bearings and exhaust ducting inspections. Ground crews inspected turbine housings for erosion and ensured lubrication lines flowed. In flight, pilots monitored manifold pressure gauges and watched for temperature spikes. In case of turbo failure, a rapid checklist included reducing boost to prevent backfire, feathering mixture to prevent detonation, and descending to lower altitude where engine performance would recover because ambient air density increased, hereby restoring power, albeit at increased fuel consumption. The process demanded that both flight and ground teams coordinate on clear protocols. Around the third of the narrative, the production story and the scale of impact drew a community CTA from the narrator. If the opening scene stirred you, you are not alone. Many veterans later said they felt that first heavy rumble like a drumbeat of fate. Tell us in the comments what surprised you the most about aircraft, whether a detail about armament, a personal anecdote, or a factory number. Write one line starting with "I was surprised by" and add a short fact or memory. That one-line format helps others scan responses quickly and invites veterans and historians to add sources and clarifications. By sharing your single line, you help create a living archive, and others will point to photos, flight logs, and documents that expand the record. After you leave that line, stay with the narrative. We return now to the hangars to trace how design choices and production swelled into strategic advantage. As the campaign progressed, doctrine changed and energy tactics became codified. Training syllabi enlarged, and air tacticians emphasized altitude control, throttle discipline, and synchronized timing of firing runs to exploit the Thunderbolt's strengths. Formations adjusted their escort patterns, with Thunderbolts assigned to high cover, where their turbocharged engines allowed maintenance of altitude and energy, whereas lighter fighters performed low-level sweeps. The psychological effect on enemy pilots was measurable. Reports from Luftwaffe intelligence referenced increased caution in attacking escorted bomber formations, acknowledging that the presence of Thunderbolts changed the acceptable risk calculus. On a macro level, the Thunderbolt contributed to the erosion of German air superiority in specific sectors by reducing bomber losses and increasing attrition of interceptor units that had to face heavily armed escorts. Material statistics accumulate to a strategic picture. By the end of the war, thousands of Thunderbolts rolled off assembly lines, millions of rounds of ammunition were expended, and hundreds of thousands of flight hours logged. The math is stark. On production lines where output ramped in months and seats on training fields were filled by new pilots coming to grips with an aircraft that demanded discipline. The sequence of evolution and adaptation continued through the campaign, with reports of later engagements where Thunderbolts flew combined arms missions, striking rail yards, bridges, and armored columns coordinated with artillery and intelligence. Pilots learned to integrate rockets and bombs. Outcomes included both tactical surprises and cost measured in aircraft and men. The Thunderbolt earned a new reputation in the Mediterranean and the Pacific, where its range, armor, and firepower made it a formidable ground attack platform. In these theaters, the plane's capacity to carry drop tanks and ordnance extended its reach and allowed it to operate from forward fields with limited service. The vocabulary of airmen shifted from scornful epithets to grudging respect, and finally to admiration when pilots saw the aircraft return from missions that would have downed lesser designs. The epilogue traces the immediate to medium-term aftermath and reflects on legacy. 1 month after the final large-scale operations, an exhausted squadron assembled on a wind-swept field to count losses and to read letters from home. The immediate moment was of repair, mourning, and assessment. 3-month mark showed technical assimilation factories continued to produce variants, software and tactics manuals circulated, and training centers incorporated the lessons of energy fighting. The Thunderbolt was not simply a plane anymore. It was a set of doctrines and industrial practices that migrated into other designs. At the 6-month horizon, the strategic map had shifted, actual deployment patterns evolved, and the enemy adjusted their training to counter new realities. Former skeptics had become instructors and sometimes authors of technical papers describing convertible tactics. Statistics had begun to coalesce by that time, tens of thousands of sorties flown, dozens of airframes lost, and many more returned, patched, and ready. The aircraft influenced pilot training doctrine in other air forces, and design philosophies shifted toward balancing survivability and firepower rather than pursuing pure agility. By war end, the numbers told a clear story. Production in series had produced thousands of Thunderbolts, tens of millions of rounds of Browning ammunition had been manufactured and shipped, and factories had retooled to support replacements for parts and armor. Pilots who had once laughed at the sight of a bulky machine now remembered its rumble as a promise of return. An enemy commander later admitted in a post-war interview that misjudging industrial mass and survivability had been a strategic error, one that left doctrinal blind spots. The Thunderbolt did not win a single battle by itself, but it forced a cascade of tactical changes that favored material depth and energy management. The lasting implication was a lesson in how production capability and doctrinal flexibility combined to shape air power outcomes. In closing, the transformation is stark. What began as an object of scorn re-emerged as an instrument of decisive pressure.
The Thunderbolt taught pilots and planners that resilience often trumped elegance in a war of attrition. More than prettiness mattered prettiness, survivability rate, and concentrated firepower. The statistics underline the thesis. Thousands of airframes produced, millions of rounds expended, hundreds of pilots turned trained aces, and countless ground missions supported. A pilot later summarized in a quiet quote, "We learned to trust its weight because it trusted to come home." And that observation captures the moral of the story. If this episode surprised you, consider subscribing to follow more narratives that blend machine detail with human experience and bring archive material to life. Discuss, share, and help keep these stories accurate by contributing memories or pointing to documents that deepen the account.